Lucas, the villa is on fire. Come back quickly. On the other end of the phone was my hoarse and desperate cry, but he coldly interrupted me. Sophie, stop making a fuss. Ella is having a heart attack, and I can't leave. Flames devoured the curtains, and the thick smoke choked me nearly to suffocation. I laughed, laughing until tears streamed down my face. Lucas, you're choosing her, right? Yes. That word, like a poisoned dagger, pierced through my last shred of hope. I hung up the phone, allowing the sea of fire to engulf me. Lucas, this is the first grand gift I have meticulously prepared for you. 3 days after my death, Lucas finally appeared in front of the villa reduced to ruins. He was dressed in an expensive custom suit, his hair impeccably combed, and his handsome face showed no trace of sorrow, only a hint of impatience. His assistant followed behind him, cautiously reporting, Lucas, madam's remains have been sent for cremation. The burns were too severe, the forensic expert said identity could only be confirmed through DNA fragments. Lucas uttered a hum, his gaze sweeping over the charred ruins as if looking at a landfill unrelated to him. What about the things she left behind? He asked. Most were burned, only the contents of the safe are intact. The assistant handed over a document, but, Lucas, there's some trouble. Lucas took the file, glanced at it, and his perpetually stoic face finally cracked. What does this mean? All my disposable assets under my name, including this villa, all shares and cash, are to be donated unconditionally to the Evening Star Charity Fund? His voice suddenly rose, carrying a tone of incredulous distortion. This is impossible. On what grounds does Sophie do this? The assistant replied tremblingly, the lawyer said this donation agreement was signed by you 3 years ago and has full legal effect. Moreover, the founder of the Evening Star Charity Fund is Madame herself. Lucas's face instantly turned ashen. 3 years ago, he remembered. It was his and Sophie's wedding anniversary. He was rushing to the airport to pick up Ella returning from abroad, but Sophie pulled him aside, insisting he sign some marital property agreement. He was extremely impatient at the time, thinking it was another of her petty tricks, and signed his name flamboyantly without even looking. He thought it was merely her boring way of asserting sovereignty. Who could have imagined it was a death trap that nearly emptied him out? Damn Sophie. Lucas kicked the charred doorframe, producing a loud bang. Even in death, she's scheming against me. He was angry, irritable, but notably without sorrow. In his heart, Sophie, was merely a woman who relied on her grandfather's favor to force a marriage with him and occupy the position of Mrs. Liu. Now that I was dead, it conveniently made room for his first love, Ella. As for the money, he, Lucas, had plenty of ability to earn it back. With a cold face, he turned to his assistant and said, investigate. Turn this Evening Star Fund upside down for me. I don't believe a housewife like her can stir up any waves. He thought this was just my unwilling revenge before death, that this was only the beginning. He didn't know that this play had been rehearsed by me for a full 3 years. And he was the sole protagonist. That evening, Lucas dined with his frightened first love, Ella. Ella nestled in his arms, weakly saying, Lucas, Sister Sophie just left like that, I'm so sad. It's all my fault. If it weren't for my heart discomfort that day, you could have been with her. Lucas held her, his voice unprecedentedly gentle. It's not your fault, she couldn't think straight. Ella, from now on, with me here, no one will wrong you again. The two were gazing affectionately when the restaurant's large screen suddenly began playing a video. The video's background was the Liu Group's annual meeting. In the footage, I held a wine glass with a proper smile. Suddenly, Ella passed behind me, seemingly accidentally bumping me, causing me to lunge forward uncontrollably, knocking over the wine tower in utter disarray. The video's angle was extremely cunning, clearly capturing the fleeting, malicious sneer on Ella's lips before she bumped me. The entire restaurant erupted in uproar instantly. Wasn't this the scandal from the Liu annual meeting a year ago? At the time, everyone said Sophie was jealous of Ella and deliberately made a fool of herself at the meeting, causing Lucas to lose face. Lucas had even slapped me for the first time because of it. But now, the complete version of the video told everyone a different story. Lucas's face instantly darkened like the bottom of a pot. He stared fixedly at the screen as if trying to see through it. He remembered that day, slapping Sophie in front of everyone. Sophie didn't cry, just looked at him, something in her eyes shattering bit by bit. At the time, he only felt annoyed. Now, that look burned like a brand, causing his heart to throb in pain. Ella's face paled too. She grabbed Lucas's arm, panicking to explain. "No, Lucas, listen to me, it's the angle, I didn't." Lucas abruptly pushed her away, his gaze cold as a knife. "Shut up." For the first time, he looked at her with such eyes. Ella was frightened into silence, tears streaming down. Lucas didn't even glance at her. He rushed out of the restaurant like a madman, drove back to the ruins. He charged into the uncleared debris, digging through the charred wood and ashes with his hands like a lunatic. "Sophie! Come out! What exactly do you want?" he roared, his voice carrying an undetected panic for the first time. Amid the ruins, only the wind whimpered, like my silent mockery. Lucas had gone mad. This was the 7th day after my death, and the news spread throughout high society. They said Lucas, president of the Lu Group, had become erratic since his wife Sophie died in the fire. He didn't go to the company, saw no one, and guarded the ruined villa all day like a lost soul. He even dug personally in the ruins, his hands bleeding profusely, as if trying to dig me out from the ashes again. I sat in the cafe across the street, wearing large sunglasses, watching the once lofty man now in utter disarray, gently stirring the coffee in my cup. How ridiculous. When I was alive, he discarded me like worn shoes. Now that I'm dead, he starts acting affectionate. Unfortunately, I'm not the audience, I'm the director. This play is far from its curtain call. Lucas's assistant, Leo, finally mustered the courage to find him in the ruins. "Lucas, you can't continue like this. The company is in chaos now, several major projects are halted, and the board has strong opinions." Leo's voice was full of anxiety. Lucas seemed not to hear, his eyes bloodshot, clutching a partially burned notebook. It was my old diary. "Look," he said hoarsely, handing the diary to Leo. "She said she likes the osmanthus cake from the shop in the south of the city because that's where we first met. But I've never bought it for her once. She said she knew all my preferences inside out, what color ties I like, what temperature coffee I drink, how many distant relatives I have. But I didn't even know she was allergic to mangoes. She said her greatest wish was to watch a sunrise with me. In 5 years of marriage, I never fulfilled it once." Lucas's voice grew lower, eventually turning into suppressed sobs. This man who never cried now had his eyes filled with crimson bloodshot veins. Leo looked at him, hesitating to speak. "These things, when Sophie was alive, Lucas, had you ever cared?" At that moment, Lucas's phone rang. It was Ella. Seeing Ella on the screen, he felt it piercing for the first time. He answered and, without waiting for her to speak, coldly asked, "What's with that video from the annual meeting?" On the other end, Ella cried pitifully, "Lucas, I really didn't mean it. It was Sophie, she provoked me first, saying I'd always be a shadowy third party. I got angry and I really know I was wrong, please forgive me?" It was the same rhetoric again. Before, whenever Ella cried, Lucas's heart would soften completely. But now, listening to her sobs, his mind was filled with the burned, incomplete words in the diary, all my silent expectations and despair in countless late nights. "Ella," Lucas's voice was cold as ice, "I remember you told me that as a child in the orphanage, you saved a little boy who fell into an icy lake. That boy was me." Ella was stunned, then quickly nodded. "Yes, Lucas, I've been looking for you for many years. That boy gave you a jade pendant engraved with a butterfly as a token." Lucas continued, his eyes fixed on a corner of the ruins. Yes. I've kept that jade pendant safe all along." Ella's tone carried a hint of joy, thinking he finally remembered her kindness. "Is that so?" Lucas suddenly sneered, the laugh filled with self-mockery and sorrow. But I just remembered, what I gave wasn't a jade pendant at all. It was a unique star made from a bullet casing. The other end fell silent instantly. Lucas's heart sank into a bottomless abyss as well. He remembered. That winter, he was abducted by traffickers and fell into the icy lake while escaping. It was a frail little girl who used all her strength to pull him up. Frozen nearly unconscious, he only remembered the butterfly-shaped birthmark on the girl's shoulder. To thank her, he gave her his cherished only memento from his father, a star polished from a spent bullet casing. He searched for her for many years. Until 3 years ago, when Ella appeared with a butterfly jade pendant, claiming to be that girl. He believed her. He doubled all his gratitude, longing, and guilt toward that lifesaver and compensated Ella. For this, he didn't hesitate to hurt his wife Sophie, who truly loved him and stayed by his side. Now, a belated truth slapped him hard across the face like a resounding blow. He was wrong, utterly wrong. Lucas hung up, as if drained of all strength, collapsing dejectedly into the ashes. Looking at his scarred hands, he suddenly dug more frantically like a madman. He needed to find evidence, to find everything Sophie left behind. He had a strong premonition that Sophie knew everything and must have left something more. Finally, in a hidden compartment under the master bedroom bed, he found an unburned metal box. The box was unlocked. Lucas opened it with trembling hands. Inside was not the letters or evidence he imagined, but a small, yellowed black and white photo. The photo showed a little girl with pigtails, smiling brightly at the camera. On her slender right shoulder, a butterfly-shaped birthmark was clearly visible. That girl was Sophie in her childhood. With a boom, Lucas's world completely collapsed. It turned out the light he had searched for half his life was right beside him all along. Yet he had personally pushed her into hell. Lucas clutched the photo, frozen as if struck by lightning. His heart was gripped tightly by an invisible hand, painful to the point he couldn't breathe. He recalled countless nights when Sophie prepared hangover soup for him, quietly waiting for his return. He remembered her clumsily learning to cook his favorite dishes, ending up with blistered hands from burns. He remembered on his birthday, her cautiously presenting a hand-knitted scarf, which he casually tossed aside because of a call from Ella. Those moments he once disdained or even found annoying now turned into the sharpest knives, slicing his heart in lingering death. Ah! A suppressed roar burst from his throat, like the wail of a dying beast. He clutched his head, curling up in agony on the ground, tears mixed with dust carving 2 wretched furrows on his handsome yet haggard face. Sophie. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He murmured over and over, but the person he wanted to apologize to could never hear it again. The cruelest punishment in the world is not death, but making you understand what is precious only after losing it. I sat in the cafe, looking indifferently through the glass window at his collapsing figure. Lucas, this is just the appetizer. What you owe me, I want you to repay with the rest of your life. Just as Lucas was immersed in boundless regret, his assistant Leo ran over again with a panicked expression. Lucas. It's bad. Big trouble. Lucas slowly raised his head, eyes full of bloodshot veins, voice hoarse like sandpaper rubbing. What now? Our company, our largest overseas partner, the Morning Star Group, has just unilaterally announced the termination of all cooperation with us. Moreover, they've joined several Wall Street capitals to maliciously short our stock. This news was even more shocking than the truth he had just discovered. The Morning Star Group was Lou's most important strategic partner, with joint projects accounting for nearly 40% of Lou Group's annual profits. Terminating cooperation was akin to severing one of Lou's arms. More terrifying was being targeted by Wall Street capitals, meaning Lou Group could face acquisition risks at any time. Why? Lucas stood up abruptly, grabbing Leo's collar. The president of Morning Star and I have a good personal relationship, he has no reason to do this. Leo's face paled in fright, stammering, I don't know either. They only sent an email saying that you betrayed someone you shouldn't have, and this is the consequence you deserve. Betrayed someone he shouldn't have. These words hammered heavily on Lucas's heart. Who else but Sophie? He staggered back a few steps, leaning against the charred wall, emitting a neurotic low laugh. Ha ha, ha ha ha. Good, what a Sophie. Truly my good wife. He thought he understood Sophie. He thought she was just a daughter flower with nothing but love. He never knew she could weave such an intricate net, not only to ruin his reputation but to completely collapse his business empire. How could she know the president of Morningstar? How could a housewife mobilize Wall Street capitals? Countless mysteries entangled him like vines, driving him nearly mad. He had to figure it out. Lucas rushed out of the ruins, driving recklessly through the city. He went to all the places we had been, to my favorite restaurants and bookstores, trying to find a clue about my true identity from these cold buildings. Finally, he arrived at the gallery I frequented most when alive. The gallery owner was a refined middle-aged man. Seeing Lucas, he wasn't surprised, just sighed and handed him a cup of hot tea. "Mr. Lucas, my condolences. You know me?" Lucas looked at him warily. "I know Miss Sophie," the gallery owner said. "She was a very talented painter and my most admired friend. When alive, she often sat here for an entire day." "Painter?" Lucas was stunned. In his impression, I only revolved around the kitchen and family. He never knew I could paint. "What, did she paint?" he asked dryly. The gallery owner didn't answer but led him to the innermost room of the gallery. The room was filled with paintings. Each one depicted the same person, Lucas. There was his focused profile during meetings, his sweat-drenched figure playing basketball, his sleeping face leaning on the sofa when drunk. Each painting was filled with deep, inseparable love and tenderness. In the corner of the studio stood an unfinished painting. It showed a man and a woman standing on a mountaintop, with a brilliant sunrise behind them. The man was him. The woman was me. That was my wish, and the painting I could never complete. Lucas looked at the room full of his portraits, at the unfinished sunrise, and could no longer hold himself up. His legs weakened, and he knelt on the ground. Covering his face, he let out beast-like painful whimpers. What a profound and desperate love he had destroyed. The gallery owner watched him, his eyes showing no sympathy, only a trace of cold satisfaction. He took out a small recorder from his pocket and pressed play. From the recorder came my voice, clear and calm. "Uncle Charles, if one day I'm gone, show him all these paintings. Tell him I loved him with my entire life. Also tell him I hate him enough to make him repay with a lifetime of pain. And, please tell Uncle Leon of Morningstar that the plan can begin. Uncle Charles, Uncle Leon." These two unfamiliar addresses, spoken in my calm voice, hammered heavily on Lucas's nerves. Uncle Charles was the gallery owner, a top domestic art connoisseur, Charles. Uncle Leon was the founder and president of the Morningstar Group, Leon. These two titans who could cause earthquakes in their fields by stomping their feet had close ties to Sophie? And from the tone, they seemed to be following my arrangements. Lucas suddenly looked up, staring fixedly at Charles. You all, what exactly is your relationship with Sophie?" Charles turned off the recorder, looking at him indifferently. "We are all people who received favors from old Mr. Henry. And Miss Sophie is the child we watched grow up. Lucas, you thought you married a helpless orphan, but you don't know that what you destroyed is the treasure we old folks would protect with our lives. Old Mr. Henry." A buzz rang in Lucas's mind. He only knew my parents died early, and I was raised by grandfather, old Mr. Henry. Old Mr. Henry was a revered master of Chinese studies domestically, and it was because of his favor to the Liu family that the Liu patriarch arranged this marriage. But he never imagined that a master of Chinese studies had connections extending to the pinnacles of business and art. He always thought I was climbing socially by marrying him. Now he realized it was he who was unworthy. "So, all this was done by you?" Lucas's voice was filled with unwillingness and madness. "Donating the family assets, exposing the video, joining Morningstar to short Liu's stocks, all planned by Sophie before her death?" "Yes," Charles admitted straightforwardly. "This is only the first step. Mr. Lucas, the net Sophie wove for you is far larger than you imagine. All the pain you inflicted on her will be returned to you 100-fold, 1,000-fold. Lucas staggered to his feet, surveying the room full of my paintings. The love in them now seemed so ironic. He had lost utterly. He not only lost all his wealth and career but also the person who loved him most in the world. No, he couldn't admit defeat like this. A wave of paranoid madness surged in his mind. Sophie, since you could set up such a grand scheme, you're so smart, how could you die so easily? The fire. DNA fragments. A bold idea, absurd even to himself, grew wildly in his mind. She wasn't dead. Sophie must not be dead. She was just hiding in some corner, coldly watching his current wretched and painful state. Once this thought arose, it could no longer be suppressed. It was like a demonic vine breaking through the soil, instantly entangling Lucas's entire mind. As if grasping the last lifeline, he rushed out of the gallery with bloodshot eyes, ignoring Charles's cold rebuke behind him. He had to find evidence. He had to prove Sophie was still alive. He rushed back to the Lou Group building, ignoring the astonished gazes of all employees, and burst into the archives room. He pulled up all the surveillance footage from the day of the fire, watching frame by frame. He mobilized all his remaining connections to investigate the institution that issued the DNA report and the source of the so-called Sophie's remains that were cremated. He locked himself in the office, sleepless and restless, like a red-eyed gambler staking everything to prove that ethereal conjecture. During this period, Ella came to him several times, each time crying heartbrokenly. Lucas, I know I was wrong, I really do. I'll return that jade pendant to you. I don't want anything, just don't abandon me, okay? But Lucas couldn't be bothered to even glance at her. Now, his mind was filled with only one name, Sophie. He watched the surveillance where, hours before the fire, Sophie calmly walked out of the villa, drove away. Her face showed no resolve for death, instead, it seemed like she was just going to an ordinary appointment. Looking at the DNA report's incomprehensible data and symbols, he hated for the first time why he wasn't a forensic expert. He looked at the funeral home records. The time the unnamed female corpse was claimed matched strikingly with when he received the fire alarm call. All clues pointed to that possibility that made his heart race. Just as he was on the verge of collapse, Leo rushed in with a file. Lucas. We found out. That body, the identity of that body. Leo's voice trembled. It's not Madam. She was a vagrant found under the West City Bridge a month ago, unnamed, kept in the city hospital's morgue all along. And someone claimed her the day before the fire using a fake identity. The office fell into deathly silence. Lucas slowly raised his head, a weird and twisted smile gradually blooming on his face. I knew it. I knew she wasn't dead. He laughed, but large tears smashed onto the desk. Those weren't tears of joy, but of immense panic and relief, like surviving a catastrophe. She wasn't dead. She was alive. She was hiding in some corner of the world, like the most skilled hunter, appreciating the prey's, dying struggles. Lucas stood up abruptly, grabbed his coat, and rushed out like a gust of wind. Prepare the car. To the airport. He roared at Leo. Mobilize all forces for a global search. Even if I have to turn the earth upside down, I'll find her. He was going to find her, kneel before her, tell her he was wrong, offer the whole world to her, as long as she was willing to return. He thought that as long as he found her, everything could still be salvaged. He didn't know that for me, finding me would be the beginning of his true hell. Lucas's search was mad and regardless of cost. He abandoned the crumbling Lou Group, dismissed all staff around him, leaving only Leo. He sold his last few properties, investing all the money into this vast search. Like a devout ascetic monk, he pursued any trace I might have left. He went to the Nordic town mentioned in my diary that I wanted to visit but never did. He stood under the aurora for a night, frozen nearly senseless, muttering my name non-stop. He went to the field depicted in my paintings, blooming with purple irises. He walked in the sea of flowers for 3 days and nights, until his feet were blistered, just to search for a possible silhouette. He went to all places I might go: Paris, Tuscany, Kyoto. At each place, he held my photo, asking repeatedly in broken local language, "Have you seen her? Her name is Sophie, she's my wife." Passers-by looked at him mostly with sympathy or confusion. Seeing this handsome yet weathered man, the paranoia and despair in his eyes, they thought he was a pitiful man missing his deceased wife. No one knew he was searching not for a dead wife, but for a living lover he had personally pushed away. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Time flew. Lucas turned from a spirited business elite into a stubbly, world-weary vagrant. His branded suits were replaced by faded old jackets. The only constant was the black and white photo of my childhood in his pocket, nearly worn indistinguishable from rubbing. Meanwhile, the Lou Group declared bankruptcy in the second year after his departure. Acquired by the Morning Star Group and several mysterious capitals, it was restructured and renamed Evening Star Technology. Ella's fate was miserable too. After Lucas left, she lost all protection. Her impersonation of the lifesaver was fully exposed, ruining her reputation. Combined with the previous annual meeting video, she became a pariah in high society. Later, it was said she married a greasy tycoon over 30 years older for money, living unhappily. Leo occasionally told Lucas these news, but Lucas listened numbly without reaction. These people and matters were no longer important to him. His only purpose in living now was to find Sophie. That day, he wandered to a serene small town on the Mediterranean coast. The town was beautiful, with white houses, blue roofs, warm sunshine, and gentle sea breezes. Dragging his weary body, he entered a streetside cafe, hoping for a cup of water. Inside, a melodious piano piece was playing. That tune. Lucas's steps halted abruptly. It was Wedding in a Dream. It was my favorite piano piece. Back then, I begged him for a long time to play it at our wedding. But he mocked me for being tacky, saying such a commonplace tune didn't suit his wedding. He stiffly turned his head toward the cafe's corner. There stood a white piano, and a woman in a plain long dress sat on the bench, back to him, her slender fingers dancing elegantly on the keys. That silhouette. Lucas's breathing stopped instantly. He nearly tumbled over, rushing forward, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, almost bursting from his throat. "Sophie?" He trembled, uttering a hoarse call that hardly seemed his own. The piano music stopped abruptly. The woman slowly turned around. A face identical to his memory entered his view. But this face no longer held the humility and ingratiation of the past. Instead, it was a calm and distant indifference he had never seen. She looked at him as if at a stranger, her eyes devoid of love or hate, only a barren calm. It was really her. Really Sophie. Lucas could no longer control himself, his knees buckled, and with a thud, he knelt before me. He grabbed my skirt hem like a lost child finally finding the way home. Tears surged out, his voice choked beyond recognition. "Sophie. I found you. I finally found you. I'm sorry. Sophie, I know I was wrong. Come back with me, okay? I'll give you everything, even my life. Please, give me another chance." He cried like a child, humbled to the dust. I quietly watched him, this man who ruined the first half of my life. I didn't help him up, nor did I speak. At that moment, a crisp child's voice came from behind me. "Mommy, who is this uncle? Why is he kneeling on the ground crying?" A boy about 4 or 5, adorably cute, ran out from the back, throwing himself into my arms, curiously looking at Lucas. Lucas's crying stopped abruptly. As if frozen by a spell, he stared blankly at the child, then at me. "Mommy?" He murmured repeatedly, his face draining of color instantly. I lowered my head, gently stroked the boy's head, and softly said, "It's nothing, an uncle asking for directions. Baby, go play in the back with Grandpa first, Mommy will come after handling this." The one I called Grandpa was the gallery owner, Charles. He came out from the back, gave Lucas a meaningful look, then took the boy's hand and went back. The entire cafe was left with just me and Lucas kneeling on the ground. He stared fixedly at me, eyes full of bloodshot and disbelief. "The child, whose is it?" he asked word by word, his voice shaking badly. I finally spoke, my voice calm like still dead water. "Lucas, you searched for me for 3 years just to ask this? Answer me!" he almost roared. Looking at his mad appearance, I suddenly found it somewhat amusing. "Whose child he is has nothing to do with you, Mr. Lucas." I stood up, looking down at him. "My husband died in that fire 3 years ago. My husband died in that fire 3 years ago." This sentence, like an invisible sword, instantly pierced Lucas's last defense. He knelt on the ground, looking up incredulously at me. His facial muscles twitched, his eyes shifting from mad anticipation to bone-deep despair bit by bit. "No. No." He shook his head, as if convincing himself. "Sophie, you can't do this to me. That child, he's not mine, right? Tell me, he's not mine." He would rather believe the child was mine with someone else than believe I had completely erased him from my life. Looking at his self-deceiving appearance, I found it utterly ironic. "Lucas, have you forgotten? In 5 years of marriage, how many nights did you come home? How many times did you lie beside me sober?" I coldly curled my lips. "What makes you think this child would be yours?" Each word hammered heavily on his heart. Yes, what right did he have? In 5 years, the times he touched me were few, and each time with condescending disgust. He gave all his gentleness and patience to Ella. He didn't even know my ovulation days. Yet I gave up my career, friends, everything for him, like a fool guarding that empty home, awaiting his occasional favor. Lucas's body swayed, as if drained of all strength. He slumped on the ground, gaze vacant, muttering repeatedly, "No, it's not like that." I couldn't be bothered to look at him again and turned to leave. "Sophie." He suddenly crawled up from the ground, hugging me tightly from behind. "I don't believe it. I don't believe you don't love me anymore. You painted so many portraits of me, did so much for me. Your love can't just disappear." His strength was astonishing, his arms locking me like iron hoops. I struggled but couldn't break free. I stopped moving, didn't turn back, just said calmly, "Lucas, do you know? The greatest sorrow is the death of the heart. Love can disappear. When you hurt me repeatedly for Ella, when I called you in my last plea for help but you chose to stay with her, the last bit of love I had for you burned to ashes along with that villa. What you see now is just a long funeral I sent you after my death. And you are the only sacrifice." My voice was light, yet carried a cruelty that chilled him to the bone. His arms holding me loosened bit by bit. I didn't linger and walked straight to the cafe's back. Uncle Charles was playing blocks with my son Nolan. Seeing me enter, he stood up, asking worriedly, "Sophie, are you okay?" I shook my head, showing a tired smile. "Uncle Charles, I'm fine. It's all over." Yes, it was all over. From the moment I decided to fake my death and escape, Lucas had been completely turned over from my life. In these 3 years, in this serene small town, I opened a small cafe, painted and played piano in my leisure, accompanying my son as he grew. My life was calm and happy. And Nolan, my son, he truly wasn't Lucas's. He was mine. Mine alone. After deciding to leave Lucas, I went to the best sperm bank abroad, chose a donor with high education, good looks, and no bad genes, and conceived him through IVF. He was the best gift from heaven, the light of my remaining life. As for Lucas, I thought when he saw my current life and Nolan, he would completely give up and disappear from my world. But I underestimated his obsession. The next day, he came again. He didn't rush in to kneel or roar, just stood across the street from the cafe, watching from afar. He was no longer the wretched vagrant, he shaved, changed into clean clothes, though still unable to hide his weathered appearance, faintly showing traces of his former self. He stood there from dawn to dusk, like a statue gazing at his wife. I ignored him, continuing to open and close the shop, pick up and drop off Nolan at kindergarten, He watched for a whole month. The town was small, rumors soon spread. People guessed what relationship the handsome yet melancholic Eastern man had with the cafe's female owner. I didn't care. But Nolan started asking, "Mommy, why does that uncle stand at our door every day?" I was silent. I didn't want Lucas's presence to disturb my son's peaceful life. That evening, I asked Uncle Charles to watch Nolan and walked out of the cafe, approaching Lucas proactively for the first time. Seeing me approach, his dim eyes instantly sparkled. "Sophie." "Lucas." I interrupted him. "What exactly do you want?" "I want to win you back." He looked at me with unprecedented seriousness. "Sophie, I know I was a bastard before, inhuman. Give me a chance to compensate you, to take care of you and the child. I'll treat him like my own son." I laughed, as if hearing the biggest joke. "Compensate? Lucas, with what? You lost only money and reputation, but I lost 8 full years of youth, a heart riddled with holes, a chance to die and be reborn. Can you repay that?" He was speechless, his face paling. As for my son, I retracted my smile, eyes turning cold. "He has me, his loving grandparents, Uncle Charles and Uncle Leon. He doesn't need a so-called father like you who might abandon him any time for another woman." "I won't," he urgently defended. "Ella. I've already made her pay. In this life, my heart has only you." "Is that so?" I looked at him, slowly asking, "Lucas, if now I tell you that the little girl who saved you back then wasn't me at all, what would you do?" He was stunned, frozen like under a spell, motionless looking at me. "What did you say?" Lucas's voice was dry as if cracking, each word filled with incredulous trembling. I looked at his paper-pale face, without a ripple in my heart. I said, I enunciated clearly, "The little girl who saved you in the icy lake back then wasn't me. This butterfly birthmark on my shoulder is a tattoo done later." I calmly lifted my right shoulder sleeve, revealing the butterfly birthmark that once made him ecstatic and regretful for life. Under the streetlight, the butterfly's edges faintly showed extremely fine ink traces belonging to a tattoo. Boom, Lucas felt the whole world spinning, a huge roar in his ears. He staggered back 2 steps, holding the wall behind to barely avoid falling. He stared fixedly at the butterfly on my shoulder, his expression from shock to confusion, then to complete collapse. Not her? How could it not be her? That black and white photo, the room full of paintings, everything in the recorder. His 3 years of searching, 3 years of regret, 3 years of self-torment, were they all built on a lie from start to finish? Like a fool, he abandoned everything, pursuing a false redemption. "No, impossible," he muttered, eyes unfocused. That photo is clearly you." "That photo, I got from a distant cousin. She did stay in an orphanage for a while as a child." I calmly shattered his last fantasy. "As for those paintings, the recorder, and the cooperation of Uncle Charles and Uncle Leon. Lucas, have you forgotten that I am the director of this grand revenge play? I know you too well. I know that merely making you lose wealth and career isn't enough to make you suffer. What I want is to destroy your heart. I want you to believe you missed the woman who loved you most in the world, the one you've been searching for. I want you to suffer day and night in this regret and guilt, never to find peace. Now it seems my plan was very successful, wasn't it?" I smiled at him, but in his eyes, that smile was more terrifying than a devil's. He looked at me, lips trembling, unable to say a word. He always thought Sophie's revenge was because she loved too deeply, thus hated intensely. He even harbored a fantasy that since there was such deep love, one day he could use his remaining life to compensate and seek her forgiveness. But now, Sophie told him personally that even that deep love he regretted missing was just a tool she meticulously designed for revenge. He, Lucas, from beginning to end, was just a pitiful and ridiculous clown manipulated in her palm. His faith, all his spiritual pillars for 3 years, were shattered by my own hands in this moment. Pfft, a mouthful of blood spurted from Lucas's mouth, splattering the cold ground. His tall body could no longer support itself, slowly sliding down the wall to the ground. Clutching his chest, he coughed violently, the last light in his eyes extinguishing completely, leaving only dead ashes. I looked at him indifferently, too lazy to even hand a tissue. "Lucas, now, do you still want to win me back?" I asked. He didn't answer, just raised his head, looking at me with an empty and shattered gaze I had never seen. After a long while, he emitted a low, wind-leaking laugh. Hee hee, hee hee hee. "Sophie, you're really ruthless." His laughter grew louder, more mad, finally turning into a shrill roar echoing under the silent night sky. He had lost. Lost completely, utterly defeated. I watched his deranged appearance, turned, and walked back to the cafe without lingering. From now on, he and I had no more ties. I thought this blow was enough to make him disappear from my world forever. But the next day, he came again. He still stood across the street, but no longer upright as before, instead leaning against the wall, hunched like a puppet with its spine removed. His face was more ashen than yesterday, eyes empty, as if his soul had been hollowed out. He just watched, silent, like a ghost about to dissipate. Days passed one by one. He no longer tried to approach or speak, just stubbornly guarded there. I continued my life, but in my heart, there was an inexplicable irritation. Until that day, when I brought Nolan back from kindergarten, crossing the road. Nolan pointed at Lucas across, whispering, "Mommy, is that uncle sick? He looks so uncomfortable." I looked in the direction he pointed. Lucas was leaning against the wall, face pale as paper, body slightly shaking, forehead covered in cold sweat. My heart tightened inexplicably. At that moment, an out-of-control truck suddenly rushed from the corner, heading straight toward us, mother and son. Everything happened too fast. I only had time to scream, instinctively shielding Nolan tightly in my arms, closing my eyes in despair. The expected intense pain didn't come. I only heard a piercing brake sound and a dull impact. Trembling, I opened my eyes. I saw Lucas had rushed over at some point, using his body to shield me and Nolan firmly. The truck hit his back. Blood rapidly spread from under him, staining a large patch of ground red. He slowly turned his head, looking at the unharmed me and Nolan, his paper-pale face showing a satisfied smile. "Sophie, you're okay, that's good." After saying this, his body went limp, falling into the pool of blood. The ambulance siren pierced the serene afternoon of the small town. Holding the pale-faced, scared Nolan, I stood dazed, watching Lucas lifted onto the stretcher by medics. His eyes were tightly closed, face without color, chest clothing stained shockingly with blood. My mind was blank. Why? Why did he rush to save me? I had clearly told him the cruelest truth, destroyed all his spiritual pillars. He should hate me to the bone, avoid me like the plague. Yet he traded his life for me and Nolan's safety. "Mommy." Nolan cried softly in my arms. "That uncle, is he going to die?" I snapped back, hugging my son tightly, voice dry, "No, he won't die." I didn't know if this was to comfort my son or myself. As if possessed, I asked Uncle Charles to take Nolan home first, while I followed the ambulance to the hospital. The emergency room's red light stayed on for a long, long time. I sat on the corridor bench, looking at that glaring red light, my heart a mix of emotions. Did I hate him? Of course. The harm he caused me, I would never forget in this life or the next. But when he lay in the blood pool, saying "You're okay, that's good," my heart, already hard as iron, still trembled uncontrollably. Hours later, the emergency room door finally opened. The doctor removed his mask, tiredly saying to me, "The patient is temporarily out of life danger. But his internal organs have multiple ruptures and bleeding, spine severely injured, whether he wakes up depends on his own will." I sighed in relief, unnoticed even by myself. I entered the ward. Lucas lay on the bed, tubes inserted all over, wearing an oxygen mask, quiet like a lifeless sculpture. Looking at him like this, I suddenly recalled the fire 3 years ago. If that day, he had returned. If that day, he hadn't chosen Ella. If. But alas, life has no ifs. I stood by his bed for a long time until Uncle Charles called, urging me back to see Nolan. I gave him a last look and turned to leave the hospital. From that day, I didn't go to the hospital again. I told myself he saved me, I paid all his medical fees, we were even. My life seemed back on track, opening the shop, painting, accompanying my son. But I began to suffer frequent insomnia. Closing my eyes, I saw Lucas falling in blood, his empty and shattered eyes. A week later, Leo suddenly found my cafe. He was more haggard than 3 years ago, temples graying. Seeing me, without anger or blame, he thudded to his knees before me. "Miss Sophie," he said with red eyes, voice choked, "I beg you, go see Lucas." I frowned. "Isn't he out of danger?" "Yes," Leo nodded, but his voice was full of despair. "His body is improving, but he himself doesn't want to live. After waking, he doesn't eat or drink, refuses any treatment. The doctor says he has no will to live. If this continues, he really will die. Miss Sophie, I know you hate him, he deserves it. But before dying, he just wants to see you one more time. I beg you, pity him, go send him off, okay?" Leo banged his head heavily on the ground, making a dull sound. I looked at him, my heart in chaos. Go or not? Reason told me I shouldn't. Lucas's life or death was none of my concern. But emotionally, I couldn't be truly indifferent. After all, he had just saved me with his life. Just as I hesitated, Nolan ran out from the back. He looked at Leo kneeling, then at me, whispering, "Mommy, is it the uncle who saved us? Something happened?" I nodded. Nolan came to my side, holding my hand, looking up. "Mommy, teacher said to repay kindness. Uncle saved us, we should go see him." Looking at my son's clear, innocent eyes, my last defense collapsed. I took a deep breath and said to Leo, "Get up. I'll go with you." When I entered the ward again, Lucas looked worse than last time. He was emaciated almost beyond recognition, eyes sunken, lips cracked, emanating a heavy aura of death. Hearing the door open, he slowly opened his eyes. Seeing me, his dead eyes finally showed a faint ripple. I had Leo and the nurse leave, the ward was left with just us two. "What are you here for again?" He spoke, voice hoarse like sandpapered. "To see if I'm dead?" "Lucas, what exactly do you want?" I walked to his bedside, looking down. "Playing the pity card? Using your life to threaten me?" He looked at me, suddenly laughing low, the laugh pulling his wounds, causing violent coughs. "Threaten you?" he gasped, self-mockingly. "Sophie, what right do I have to threaten you? I saved you not to make you forgive me or return to me. I just don't want to see you hurt anymore. What I owe you, I can't repay in this life. If my life can make you feel better, take it." He said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as if death was a release for him. Looking at him, my irritation grew stronger. "You want to die? Not so easy." I sneered. "Lucas, you think dying ends it all? I tell you, what you owe me, I want you to repay alive. I want you to see with your own eyes how happy my son and I are. I want you to live in regret and pain for life, that's your greatest punishment." He quietly looked at me, his empty eyes slowly filling with tears. "Sophie." He trembled, reaching out as if to grab me. Are you concerned about me? Don't flatter yourself." Like a cat with its tail stepped on, I slapped his hand away sharply. "I just don't want my lifesaver to die so pathetically, making me uncomfortable later." After saying that, I didn't look at him again and turned to leave. At the door, I stopped, without turning back, coldly throwing, "Lucas, if you have any guts, live well for me." The moment I closed the door, I heard long-suppressed, heart-wrenching cries from the ward. From that day, Lucas began cooperating with treatment. Like an obedient patient, he ate on time, took medicine, actively did rehab. His body recovered at an astonishing speed, as if my words "live well for me" became his new will to live. I didn't visit him again. Just occasionally heard about him from Leo. Leo said Lucas was very quiet now, mostly in a daze, sometimes staring out the window for a whole day. Leo said Lucas asked him to buy many books on child-rearing and child psychology, reading them daily. Leo said Lucas asked if it was too late to learn making osmanthus cake now. Listening to these, my heart had no ripples, just occasional trances. Months later, Lucas was discharged. He didn't leave the town but rented a small house not far from my cafe. He no longer stood across the street watching me. He just placed a small box of handmade osmanthus cake at my cafe door every morning, then silently left. The osmanthus cakes became more refined and tastier each time. I never ate them, having Uncle Charles dispose of them daily. He also started sending the freshest roses to my cafe daily, not tacky red ones, but my favorite elegant variety called Juliet. He seemed to want to clumsily refill the details he once owed me bit by bit. I still ignored it. I thought if I remained indifferent, he would eventually retreat. But I underestimated his stubbornness again. That day was Nolan's kindergarten parent-child sports day. By rule, each child needed a parent to accompany. I planned to go alone, but Uncle Charles and Uncle Leon were busy and couldn't come. Alone, participating in so many events was indeed strenuous. Just as I worried, Lucas appeared. He stood before me, much thinner than before, but his eyes no longer empty and dead, instead carrying a cautious, almost humble plea. Sophie, he held a beautifully packaged lunchbox. Can I accompany Nolan to the sports day? Just, as his uncle. I made his favorite chicken wings and pudding. I promise I won't cause you any trouble. I just want to accompany him. I looked at him, then at Nolan beside me with a face full of expectation, my heart wavering for the first time. In these months, Nolan had grown used to Lucas's presence. Though he didn't know the exact relationship between this uncle and Mommy, he could feel the uncle meant no harm. Mommy, let Uncle come with us, okay? Other kids have dads accompanying them. Nolan tugged my hem, whispering coquettishly. The word dad pricked me like a needle. I was silent for a moment, finally nodding. Remember, you're just an uncle. I emphasized coldly. Okay. Okay. He was overjoyed, nodding repeatedly, eyes reddening. That day's sports meet, Lucas performed more dutifully than any father. He joined Nolan in the three-legged race, carrying him to finish and win first place. He lifted Nolan high overhead for the basketball throw. Sweating profusely, panting, but his face always bore a satisfied smile. During halftime, other kids boasted about their dads. Nolan proudly puffed his chest, saying to all, "My uncle is the best." Hearing this, Lucas stiffened, then the light in his eyes dimmed again. Watching this, my heart felt indescribable. After the sports meet, Lucas sent us home. Before leaving, he stuffed something into my hand. "What is this?" I asked. "You'll know when you look." He gave me a deep look, then turned, limping away into the night. His leg had sequelae from the last accident. Back home, I opened the small box he gave. Inside wasn't a valuable gift, but a star polished from a bullet casing. That star was identical to the one he gave his lifesaver back then. Only on the back, small words were engraved, "Sophie, I'm sorry." And, "Thank you." I held that cold bullet casing star, dazed for a long, long time. The next day, no osmanthus cake at the cafe door. Nor the third or fourth day. Lucas seemed to have evaporated from the town completely. That familiar irritation returned to my heart, stronger than ever. I told myself, him leaving was perfect, wasn't it what I always wanted? But why did my heart feel so empty? Until a week later, Leo found me again. He brought news that shocked me beyond measure. "Miss Sophie, Lucas he returned home to turn himself in." Turn himself in? I was stunned. What crime? Commercial fraud, insider trading, and, 3 years ago, to secure a project, Lou Group drove a small company boss to death. Lucas took all these on himself. Leo's voice was full of fatigue and helplessness. Actually, many things weren't done by him, but by those old board guys. but he took all the evidence on himself. He said this is what he owes the world. Miss Sophie, before going in, he asked me to give this to you. Leo handed me a letter and a share transfer agreement. Evening Star Technology, the restructured Lu Group, he transferred all his original shares to your name. He said these were yours to begin with. He also said in this life, he did too many wrongs, betrayed too many. He doesn't seek your forgiveness, only wishes you and the child a lifetime of peace and joy. Miss Sophie, he might be sentenced to life. Life imprisonment. These 4 words pressed on my heart like 4 heavy mountains. Holding the transfer agreement and letter, I stood dazed in the cafe, unable to recover for a long time. I opened the letter. On the paper was Lucas's familiar, vigorous handwriting. Sophie, when you see this letter, I should already be in the place I belong. Please don't worry about me, this might be my best destination. These years were like a long, painful dream. Awakening, I realized what I had done. I hurt you and ruined myself. I once thought finding you and compensating would give another chance. Until you told me the truth that day, I understood my mistakes were irreparable forever. I'm not the one worth your life to love, nor the light you've been searching for. I'm just a pitiful fool blinded by jealousy and arrogance. I don't even qualify to love you, let alone seek your forgiveness. On the accident day, when the truck hit me, I felt a trace of relief. I thought if my death could let you completely let go of the past, let you and Nolan live peacefully, it would be worth it. But you made me live. Sophie, it was you who gave me life again. So, the remaining days, I want to use for atonement. Atone for the sins against you, for the sins against the world these years. The shares of Evening Star Technology should be yours. I'm just returning them. Please accept them, give Nolan a better future. I dare not hope you visit me, I don't deserve it. I only hope one day in the future, when you occasionally think of me, it's not just hate left. If possible, please tell Nolan there was once a very bad uncle, but he used his remaining life trying to become a good person. Lucas. Final words. On the paper were smudged watermarks, unsure if his tears or mine. Holding the letter, my body trembled uncontrollably. I thought my heart was already an ancient well without waves, but at this moment, that dry well surged with towering waves. Hate? Yes, I still hate. But when a person uses his life, his remaining years, everything to repent and atone to you, that hate seems no longer so pure. It was like a seed wrapped in a hard shell, after the shell is chipped bit by bit, revealing the softest inside, a trace even I unwilling to admit, heartache. I cried. After my death, after my rebirth, for the first time I shed tears for Lucas. Not because of love, nor forgiveness. Just for a lost soul who took the wrong path but chose the most tragic way to return to the right one. 5 years later. This Mediterranean small town still had bright sunshine. The cafe business grew better, I opened 2 branches. Nolan grew into a handsome young boy, smart, kind, the most popular in school. My life was calm like a soothing poem. That day, I received Leo's call. He said Lucas, due to good behavior in prison and major meritorious service, reporting deeper crime evidence of those directors, got a reduced sentence. Today was his release day. I was silent for a long time. On the other end, Leo cautiously asked, Miss Sophie, will you go pick him up? I hung up without answering. I changed into a plain long dress, drove to that city I never wished to set foot in. At the prison gate, people came and went. I saw him. Wearing faded old prison clothes, carrying a simple bag, standing at the door, somewhat blankly looking at this familiar yet strange world. 5 years of prison life carved deeper marks on him. His hair half white, deep crow's feet, back somewhat hunched, no longer showing the shadow of the once arrogant Lucas. He saw me. He was stunned, as if thinking he was dreaming. He rubbed his eyes, seeing me still there, daring to believe it real. He walked toward me, steps staggering. He stopped before me, lips moving but no words, eyes gradually reddening. I looked at him, he looked at me. Sunlight through leaf gaps cast dappled shadows between us. After a long while I extended my hand, calmly saying, "Lucas, long time no see." Looking at my extended hand, his tears finally burst. He didn't grasp it but stepped back, bowing deeply, deeply to me. "Sophie," he raised his head, voice hoarse yet with unprecedented relief, "thank you for still willing to see me." I looked at him, slowly smiling. That smile had no hate, no love, only the lightness after weathering countless storms. "Let's go," I said, "I'm here to take you home." He was stunned, looking incredulously at me. I didn't explain, just turned toward the parking. He hesitated a moment, finally following, keeping one step's distance. Under the sunset, our shadows stretched long. I knew we could never go back. Forgiveness might be a lifelong lesson. But letting go can happen in a thought.